I'm Raja Mohan. I'm the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies. So let me welcome you all for this afternoon's discussion on Sri Lanka at Crossroads. It is centered around a book that's been published by the World Scientific. Before I congratulate the author, Dr. Asanga Abhay, and my two colleagues who are a part of the panel, I just want to state how delighted we are, I think, to welcome the author to this. I also want to say, while generally most of our activities, given the size of India, tends to focus on what India is doing or India's relations, but I think when there is some time people look at India and Pakistan, but there's not enough attention paid to the other countries in South Asia. It's my belief that Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, each one of them, Afghanistan, of course, is in a category of its own. All of them are important for the international politics. Their location makes them important for regional integration, and their value and their importance has dramatically gone up in the last decade and more. So we hope at ISAS in the days ahead, as part of our agenda to study contemporary South Asia, we will be able to devote more attention to, I don't want to use the word smaller, because Sri Lanka is pretty big. 30 million people. Bangladesh has got 160. So these are not small countries. They're small only in comparison to India, but each one of them is important in its own respect. And therefore, I think it's important to see the value of these countries. And I noticed that in the last few years, Singapore and ASEAN are taking more interest in the other countries, especially Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, of course, has a long history of engagement with ASEAN. They almost became members at one point. It's a long story, so we don't want to get there. But I think today, Singapore and Sri Lanka have a free trade agreement. That's an important one, and that is one part. And recently, the Bangladesh elections, we have a prime minister who is coming back for a third term. And the economic success of Bangladesh makes it an increasingly attractive economic partner to much of East Asia. China is already there in a big way. You have other countries in the region trying to partake in Bangladesh's growth. In the case of Nepal, again, Nepal is a bridge between India and China. So is Bhutan. So I think you have actually a fascinating picture of South Asia, which the smaller countries bring to the table. So this is a moment, I think, for us to express that commitment to say that we're going to do more about these countries. The discussion today is centered around this book, Sri Lanka at Crossroads, Geopolitical Challenges and National Interests by Abhay Gunashekara. Now, don't be deceived by his looks. He looks young, and he is young. But I think he's today one of the most important contributors to international understanding on Sri Lanka. I think he runs a very important think tank in Colombo. It's called Institute for National Security Studies, which is part of, supported by the Ministry of Defense. The president himself, right, is the patron of the institute, and the defense minister sits on the council. So the institute itself is a new one, but it's of growing importance. And what we've seen in the last few years, I think Sri Lanka has come out of the civil war, of a brutal civil war of nearly 3 decades. Since then, the economic prospects have improved, while there are issues of political reconciliation, etc. But generally, today, Sri Lanka receives a lot more attention and interest because its location in the Indian Ocean. It is almost at the dead center of the Indian Ocean, and historically, Sri Lanka was at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean. All the major maritime trading powers, that is starting with the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and Americans, everyone looked at Sri Lanka as one of the critical elements of the Indian Ocean. Today, we have the Chinese taking a lot more interest because of Sri Lanka's location and its importance for long-term stability, security, and integration of the Indian Ocean. More broadly, other countries see Sri Lanka as a critical player of the Indo-Pacific. So I think we are here at the cusp of, looking at Sri Lanka, giving more attention, trying to understand more what's going on in that country. So I'm not going to get into the details of the book, but it covers a lot of aspects, including geopolitics, domestic politics, foreign relations, peace building and reconciliation, democracy and institution building, as well as cybersecurity and other related issues. So let me welcome Dr. Gunashekara again, and I have two of my colleagues from ISAS, Dr. Amitindu Palit and Chulani, also here. So they're going to participate in the discussion. So we're going to start with Gunashekara. He's going to explain the book, and then we'll have the two panelists speaking after that. Then we'll throw it open for discussion. And as you can see, ISAS, we're trying to make it more informal, simple. So we're going to sit and talk on the table rather than a formal lecture. Welcome.
Thank you, Raja. So, Raja, Amitu, and Dr. Chulani, distinguished scholars as well as ambassadors, and ladies and gentlemen. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I thank you for the invitation. And Raja has been, we've been bumping to each other. So even last week we were there at Raisina. So a scholar that is very close to Sri Lanka and with the Sri Lankan community also. And it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Raja. So let me sort of begin basically about my book, why the topic Sri Lanka at Crossroads, why the topic came in. It was not because of the recent constitutional crisis, so the topic came much earlier. And the reason is because we see a clear sort of a polarization in the society between the Western and the non-Western, or the Asian, the Chinese, I would say, the camps. And you can see that slowly materializing. And during the constitutional crisis, which happened in August, President Rajapaksa, who was the former president who was there, and clearly the Chinese was supporting, the Chinese embassy, as well as they were supporting one political party and another political party being sort of in the Western camp, while in the US as well as the other European Union, EU, supporting the other camp. So you see a deep polarization in the society also between the two camps. And how I analyze the situation is bringing geopolitical elements, the influences to the country, and seeing this from the Chinese infrastructure projects, such as in Hambantota, the Matale Airport, the Chinese port projects, which is happening in Colombo, and also the other influences that is coming in to the country. So I see this, I call it the triple spear of influence in the book, the Indian influence, which is the closest, the neighbor which we have, the largest, as well as the geographically, the largest, basically the country in the South Asia, and having the Indian influence first, and then we have the US and also the Chinese influence, the triple spear of influence that's been coming towards the country. And the writings basically, if you look at the geopolitical, the chapter, and also the international relations chapter, I sort of analyzed the situation looking at the last 70 years of independence. While Sri Lanka celebrated last year 70 years of independence, I see the situation, how it's sort of unfolding, and the influences coming in to different regimes, different governments. And whether policymakers are taking calibrated decisions are questions that I sort of raise. It is a larger canvas which I try to depict, and a larger canvas in a sense bringing in various areas, not only in foreign relations, but also looking at domestic implications, political implications, certain promises made at elections not delivered. For example, the Sirisena's 100-day campaign, there was not delivery of, they couldn't deliver much of what was said, the constitutional changes that was promised. Then again, falling into a trap in a sense that Rajapaksa, who was defeated back in 2015, coming back in the local elections as one of the with the populist sentiments and how it is coming. But then again, I compare this even with the global arena also, that while in the United States you have the Trumpism or the populist sentiments coming in there, and you see two divided clear fractions, and my analysis is not only looking at Sri Lanka, but it's happening to other parts of the world also. And this was actually even Stephen Harper discussed at the Raisina dialogue, saying that we need to look at the polarization of the center-left and the center-right, looking at a center in between the two camps. And he sees it happening in the global arena. So clearly the global leaders are seeing this. And so when you look at the Sri Lankan institutions, basically, I analyzed the strength of the institutional capacity of on fighting corruption. For example, the present government of Sirisena came into power on the slogan of fighting corruption, but have they managed to put people behind bars? And there have been total failures in the corruption investigations, and there has not been many who was arrested, and so those are the reasons that Rajapaksa won the local elections, and some of the clear reasons. So going back, basically, with Singapore, I have made a lot of reference to Singapore, and I made a reference to Lee Kuan Yew in 1956, where he says that he compares Sri Lanka and saying that Sri Lanka, Colombo is a much better city than Singapore, and we need to look at Colombo. But I sort of refer to Lee Kuan Yew's words and say, let's listen to what Lee Kuan Yew has said, and let's build this place. And there are many references to Singapore, especially on meritocracy that Singaporean government adopts on selecting its members to the parliament, as well as to make policy. And you have the Sri Lankan parliament, which is 225 members, and out of that, majority does not have the basic A levels or the educational qualifications to so to have the basic meritocracy. Some sort of level of meritocracy is really important, especially in a century where you have the fourth industrial revolution and all this is unfolding, and it is important that you have some sort of and I've referred also to Singapore on the innovation culture which are built on STEM, focusing on the STEM education and all that. So there are many references to Singapore. And this is probably because of my interaction with the Singaporean scholars as well as my travels, because most of my travels, this is written as Professor Swaran Singh clearly, he reviewed this book, and he says that I've been writing traveling between one airport to the other airport, because the geopolitical influences, how I calculate it, is actually looking at not only Sri Lanka, but bringing in the global picture also. So I think there are clearly, I've mentioned about the Indo-Pacific, the concept of the FOIPs, basically on what it's. I see it as a rechristening of basically Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and what the whole Quad is about, and why basically the Quad composed because of the US, the Australian, India, and Japan, and how Sri Lanka sees it, and you will be able to find in the book what our perspective is, and about the concept of Quad, and how important is to build relationship with India. Especially because of the Kaveri Delta influence. I call it the India-Sri Lanka relations, looking at the Dravidian, the Tamilian, the culture where it's coming from, which is the Kaveri Delta, and its influence to the country. It's been there from the ancient times, and it's going to remain for the next 100 years, and it's not going to go away. So the policymakers need to sort of take in this influence very carefully and work with the South Indian, basically the Tamil Nadu politicians, and this is really important. And it is important also for the reconciliation process that we are sort of working on. Now, the reconciliation chapter, I begin with Dr. Neelan Tirichalan's a quotation from his wife, actually, and Dr. Neelan Tirichalan was assassinated, a Harvard scholar who was working, and many leaders were assassinated, Tamilian leaders, by the LTTE. But then, how should we look at the future, and what sort of ways, how can we reconcile with the Tamilian community? Now, there are various ways of reintegration strategies, which I discuss in the book, with the diaspora. And you could see one of them is bringing in genuine reconciliation process of, talking to the community who's living outside the Sri Lankan, basically outside Sri Lanka, so such as in Canada, in Germany, and various other places. But the question is raised by the diaspora is there a genuine reconciliation process going on? If you look at the Sri Lankan process, which started after the war in 2009, now it's 10 years for this year, Sri Lankan government has invested quite a lot on infrastructure on the northeast. If you look at the reconstruction process, there's been a huge success in that. Rehabilitation of 13,000 combatants and all that. So there's been success in that. Then the reintegration process. So all three elements we have addressed. But there are challenges. Yes, there are huge challenges within the process also. For example, the recent killing of the two police officers, which happened by ex-combatant, a Tamilian rehabilitated ex-combatant. But there could be incidents as such. That could happen in the society who is going through post-conflict. We had the war for 30 years. These incidents can happen, but that doesn't mean that the LTTE is coming back. And the LTTE has no factors to say that the LTTE is coming back, and we would have to face this again, because that whole period of 30-year war, which the entire community suffered, and I myself being a direct victim, and many others in the society have direct or indirect been victims, losing their loved ones. So we don't want that to happen again. Well, the society, I think what we need is wider sort of reintegration with the Tamilian community. That is really important. And some of the other areas which, there are 6 thematic areas, in the book, which is, that's why I say it's a larger canvas: geopolitics, political landscape, foreign relations, peace building and reconciliation, and democracy and institution building, and cybersecurity and foresight. So I refer to works, Sri Lanka's geographical position, as Raja mentioned, is important, but looking at the work of Ptolemy and why Sri Lanka was elongated in his map, I think it's because of trade relations, even at that time, what we had. But Sri Lanka is sitting at a very interesting position of Nicholas Spikeman's the Rimland. And I noticed that it is touching the rimland and the outer crescent of the rimland. And I have, with my bad drawing, I have done a drawing on Mackinder's map, and you could see that on the book. And that I compare it with Japan, how Japan is facing the Pacific and the United Kingdom facing the Atlantic, and how Sri Lanka is facing the Indian Ocean. And referring to the works of the modern day geopolitical thinkers, such as Robert Kaplan or Parag Khanna, and saying that if the century is in the Indian Ocean, and Sri Lanka is important because of its geographical position. And that's why the relationship, Indo-Sri Lanka relationship, is so important in this century. So going back to, if you look at the book begins with an aircraft carrier, the USS Nimitz coming in. And as you know, Sri Lanka has been sort of bringing in many aircraft carriers to naval vessels. So a few days ago, a Japanese vessel came in, and for every month you will have port calls. But I compare the USS Nimitz as a floating base. Now, because there's discussions about setting up bases in the Indian Ocean and Indian Ocean countries, also in Sri Lanka. There are many discussions out there, but aircraft carriers are also floating bases. And how China is building up its blue water marine, the muscles basically by adding 300 vessels to his fleet. And Pentagon reports referring to saying that this is one of the largest buildup of any military in the recent history. The production lines are very short. The submarines, the incidence of submarines, I have reference to that. Basically highlighting when the submarine came to the Chinese submarine came to Sri Lanka, the last in 2014 or 14. And so that was a huge incident between New Delhi and Colombo. And it was not a knee-jerk. Our policymakers did calculate it. We did inform India. They knew about it. But there was a lot of reaction. So to cement that, what I sort of discussed that we need more strategic discussion, security discussion among the two nations, because this occurrence will happen again. It will definitely happen. And so whether we are going to sort of react every time a submarine visit. And how on the Indian influence even is discussed right now. If you look at it, the Palali airstrip, whether we are going to go to India, whether we are going to, because Indians, in the north. Yeah, in the northern side of India. Palali, yeah. So they're interested. The Indians are interested to set up. They're keen to do a feasibility, but there's been a sort of a discussion whether we should give it to a strategic airstrip to the Indians. So these are like some of the points that I highlight. And I think the overall, the last chapter I discussed is about future, the futurist, and how important is foresight analysis, whether policymakers have to bring in foresight analysis to its policy making. And so basically, it gives a whole wider range of areas. On the debt trap issue, I highlight that and sort of conclude whether Sri Lanka is under debt trap. If you look at it carefully, the sovereign bonds are much more. If you look at the quantity of sovereign bonds are much more than the Chinese loans. Now, this is clearly been again referred by the Verity Research head Dishant Demel in his new article, which was released a few days ago, analyzing the quantity and basically of the Chinese debt. Whether it's a predatory loan, I refer to Matisse. Whether they've been sort of controlled by Chinese sphere. No, I don't think so. These are sort of, I think, kind of simplified by certain media groups, and it is not so. So I think I'll leave with that. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And maybe you want to go ahead. Yeah. Dr. Paul.
Thank you very much, Professor Raja Mohan. An honor to be present on this occasion discussing Asanga's book. I'll make a few points with respect to some of the broader issues that Asanga has captured and a larger economic perspective. I think it's very interesting that he calls the book Sri Lanka at Crossroads, because Sri Lanka indeed as a country is at the crossroads. And when I say so, I refer to it purely from an economic geographic perspective. It is at the intersection of a very wide web of maritime traffic moving from various parts of the world, north to south, east to west. And this just doesn't include very elaborate traffic coming from the East Pacific via the South China Sea, via the Strait of Malacca, into the Indian Ocean, further upward into the Persian Gulf, and then into the Atlantic. But it also includes much smaller traffic, like say, for example, the traffic that is moving from Gulf to the Bay of Bengal, to give one example. What we often don't realize is that it's not just the length of the maritime traffic, it's also the volume of sheer physical presence of containers on this route. And Sri Lanka gets to have a large amount of these containers, making it the spot of call. I'm not calling it the port of call, but making it the spot of call. So in that sense, Sri Lanka has a very important presence when it comes to the continental maritime shipping atlas or frames, purely in terms of maritime commercial traffic. And the other unique part of Sri Lanka as a country is that Sri Lanka is one of the two South Asian countries which cannot be connected by land. That's why it has never figured in the conversation on economic corridors, because economic corridors have always typically been aligned with land corridors. But this is one country which cannot be connected by land. In fact, in this respect, even Singapore can be connected by land, and it is indeed being connected by land. But Sri Lanka cannot, other than Maldives. These are the two countries in South Asia which cannot be connected by land. So the entire vision of connectivity with respect to Sri Lanka has to be maritime, and there has to be the other direction, which is the cyber connectivity. Now, what this essentially means is that when Asanga talks about Sri Lanka and talks about geopolitics and national interests, one thing becomes pretty much clear, what Professor Rajamohan has alluded to, what Asanga has also alluded to. Sri Lanka's biggest strength is probably its geography. There's no denying that. It's a unique geography, and it's positioned to commercially and economically exploit the geography. The issue over here is that while the geography gives it opportunities, it also brings with it some challenges. And in the kind of optimal manifestation of these opportunities. Now, well, we know that Sri Lanka is pretty much the center of attention. It is the hub of a large number of conversations that is going on with respect to the regional connectivity discourse. It's being visualized prominently as part of the Indo-Pacific construct. It's being visualized prominently as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also featuring prominently in the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and related connectivity initiatives. But the point is, in what respect? Why is Sri Lanka important? Well, one part of it is the fact that it is a country which cannot be avoided in any maritime movement. So ships, containers, civil containers, commercial containers, military containers, all have to necessarily look at Sri Lanka closely. From a Sri Lankan perspective, what this geography probably means is that it needs to exploit this geography on the basis of a very proactive, externally outward-oriented policy. This is something on which we can debate this, but this is something which Sri Lanka has been a little hesitant about, except for the last 3 to 4 years. Traditionally, while Asanga mentioned about the old ancient trade routes, they have all existed. But purely in terms of a policy vision, it's only the last 3 to 4 years that we see the Sri Lankan government trying to increasingly build in far-reaching, forward-looking, proactive, external economic engagement policy. The problem over here is that this is something which is new to Sri Lanka. I mean, it's one thing to know about the fact that historically Sri Lanka has been part of a trading geography. It's another thing to position itself as a prominent actor in modern trade and commerce, which has changed vastly from what it used to be earlier. It's no longer just a question of ships moving from one point to other. It's more or less a question of now positioning it according to the global value chains, according to the production networks, and a whole host of other connected issues. So to me, while geography presents a great opportunity for Sri Lanka, I think the biggest challenge, or at least one of the biggest challenges that Sri Lanka faces in this regard, is to prepare its institutions in such a way that they are able to respond to this challenge and push the country forward in a direction where it will be able to have a proactive trade policy, a proactive external investment policy, and a broader external engagement policy. Sri Lanka already has entered into a free trade agreement with Singapore. It's working on free trade agreements with China and India. It's looking to become a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement down the line. There are more FTAs that it will visualize. But the point is, I think the larger point to be noted over here is that is Sri Lanka prepared for these FTAs? Small countries look at trade agreements as an opportunity for expanding the market that they can cater to because their internal market is small. Now, is Sri Lanka really prepared to do that? I think the fear and hesitation over here is, as is traditional, that once Sri Lanka gets into these agreements, the domestic market would be swamped by foreign goods. There would be foreign workers coming in, and there would, to that extent, be a degree of compromise in terms of the market access that is given away. It's a legitimate fear. It's a legitimate fear. It's a fear that exists not only just among small countries, it exists among the biggest of countries, not to say the least in India and also in China and above all in the United States of America. But for Sri Lanka, the challenge is a little different because Sri Lanka needs to crack its market access in other countries. And for that, its exports have to become competitive. And it's not just one export. It needs to be a whole range and a basket of exports. And we are not even talking about just primary product export. We are not just talking about tea. We are not just talking about garments. We are talking about much bigger, long-term value additive exports, which are not just manufacturing, but also services. And that requires careful study of the value chains and areas where Sri Lankan producers can plug in. So it's a lot of background work which needs to go into this direction. Let me come to another interesting point on an aspect of Sri Lanka which has been talked about a lot. Ports. Almost all big countries in the region seem interested in investing in ports in Sri Lanka. I mean, it all began with China. There's an interest from Japan. There's an interest from India. Singapore is also part of the story. Now, there's an interesting element here which is often overlooked. Sri Lanka is a relatively small country, and as a result of that, its ports do not serve a very big domestic hinterland. What does it mean for the economics of the port? It's very different from building a port in the east coast of mainland China. It's very different from building a port in the east or west coast of India, which serve very big hinterlands. So any port that comes up in Sri Lanka, whether it's Colombo, whether it's Trincomalee, whichever, they need to handle this issue of a small hinterland, which means from a developer's perspective, that's not from where the bulk of revenue is going to come. The bulk of revenue is going to come from transshipment. And that is where Sri Lanka's core advantage lies. That is where the Colombo port has been able to establish itself as one of the most prominent transshipment locations. And that is where Sri Lanka has been able to achieve a great degree of success in sheer port efficiency operations. The challenge over here is that can a country have multiple transshipment ports on both its coasts? The challenge here, to be more specific, is can other Sri Lankan ports do what Colombo has done? Now, this is a very difficult question to answer. And then again, to come back to the developer's perspective, if the volume is not that high from the domestic economy, if it's a very competitive transshipment scenario, then why do you build a port? Is it for strategic reasons? Is it for geopolitical reasons? I'm not one to answer that. But all that I want to put on the table is that this is an arithmetic and an economic, which is going to remain with the port developer, because volumes are not going to come from the internal economy. They are going to come to an extent, but not that much. Sri Lanka is not a country where you can have huge pipelines going through the country for supplying oil in all parts. Not comparable to even a fourth of, let's say, the Indian subcontinent or even Pakistan or even Bangladesh, where the volume is much, much higher. So I think this is where there is a question of economic feasibility. And when we talk about economic feasibility with respect to Sri Lankan ports, I think this is a point which needs to be noted, because the immediate short-term to medium-term economic feasibility purely by port operations is going to be limited. So which means developers with only deep pockets can come into port development. Now the point is, would they come in just for commercial gains? Because those commercial gains might be limited in the short term and in the medium term. So this is a challenge. It's a very, very difficult challenge to handle for Sri Lankan policymakers. I know that. But this is a challenge which is going to remain, because this is a challenge which comes out of its unique geography. So it's a chicken and egg problem. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Dr. Chulan.
Thank you, Professor Mohan, and congratulations once again to Mr. Abhay Gunasekara on his new book. When I saw the title Sri Lanka as at Crossroads, that for me it is like Sri Lanka's challenge in balancing how to realize its national interest amidst rising geopolitical tension in the region. As Dr. Palit explained, because of its unique geography, there comes opportunities as well as challenges. So when it comes to Sri Lanka, the challenges sometimes override the opportunities. Because over the years we see that Sri Lanka's national interests also have changed a little bit. Before 2009, the primary interest was eradicating terrorism. So after that, now there is national security as a primary interest, of course, but also the economic development. In realizing economic development, therefore, Sri Lanka tries to look at different partners, but these partners are in a competition in the region: India, China, United States. Because of their competition in the region, Sri Lanka is facing some difficulties in how to realize its interest of developing its economy. Apart from that, I also see some domestic challenges that Sri Lanka is facing. For in terms of its national security, despite the fact that war has officially over, we see that there's a rise of nationalism and ethnocentrism in the country, which is rising over the years, over the past 10 years, despite the fact, even though it was expected that after the end of the war, the country will be united, we see that ethnic polarization rising over the years. So this brings a lot of challenges in realizing peace and reconciliation in the country. Mr. Abhay Gunasekara mentioned that he's discussing this in details in his book, and sometimes these points must have been highlighted as well. So when ethnic polarization is rising, there is always concern of security, which I think affect economic development, because investors definitely want a secure environment. So for a country which just came out of a 30 decade of war, if they are again dividing based on some of the same aspects that they were divided in that period of time, this is obviously going to be a concern. And again, as I think some of the points Dr. Palit already mentioned, Sri Lanka talks about being a hub in terms of becoming, as its plan to develop its economy. But then whether we have the domestic industry to support that sort of a plan. So in that case, whether the policymakers have identified what are the alternative methods in becoming a hub, and if the industries are not its primary focus, then whether we have the capability of becoming a service hub, what are the opportunities or what are the challenges. I think even though the concept of hub is being discussed, these important aspects of it are not in the discussion in the policy circle as yet. Also, there is another aspect of trust and confidence in the institutions. Sri Lanka, domestically, Sri Lanka is facing a lot of issues due to corruption, and it is being discussed every single day. And every government comes in with a promise of eradicating corruption, but then you see more corruption within their period of time. Because of that, again, how investors will be convinced if the institutions are weak about investing in a country. Sri Lanka being a small country, obviously we do not have the capacity to single-handedly fund our own investments. We need investors to come in. So for that's why we need institutional trust and confidence. Of course, I think geopolitics has been discussed so much, and in the geopolitical terms, the biggest challenge Sri Lanka faces, I think, is due to the competition between three major players. They all see Sri Lanka as a strategic point, and because of that, every investment that will come has some strategic concern. And as a result of this, these investments are seen for strategic purpose rather than for economics purpose. I think the best example would be Hambantota and Mattala Airport. Even before they came into existence, the discussion started about how it is going to be strategically a concern for India and how it is going to affect India's security. So when these things happen, obviously the economic prospects or the opportunities of these projects are undermined, and the geostrategic and security concerns come into surface. So I think these are the few of the challenges that Sri Lanka is facing in its new national interest of economic development, and because Sri Lankan policymakers has to find a way in balancing between these geopolitical challenges while making realizing its economic national interests. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that starts us off on a good note. I mean, but before I go to the floor, maybe I just had maybe 3-4 points. Maybe you can just respond to. I mean, in a brief fashion, because we talked a lot about location as being Sri Lanka's principal issue. What is that location doing? I mean, I think in 4 aspects, that's what I wanted to press you. One, the question of Sri Lanka as a... There was a time when Sri Lanka was non-aligned. In fact, Sri Lanka was one which pushed the whole argument on Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. But today, you are beginning to open up. There are Chinese, maybe Indians want something, the Japanese want something. So what do you become? I mean, how do you manage this? I mean, so is there a strategy? I mean, I think partly a question there. You mentioned the UK and Japan. I mean, Japan has certainly been called an aircraft, a standing, unsinkable aircraft carrier. So do you see Sri Lanka too as an aircraft carrier? But then the question becomes, to which country does it actually become an aircraft carrier? Second, I think the location is also about identity, right? I mean, that until now, I mean, all of us have seen Sri Lanka predominantly a South Asian country. But your leadership in the last 4-5 years has been talking about, we're not just a South Asian country, but we're an Indian Ocean country. Is that serious? Is there a prospect that how do you define that larger identity? Then that takes you to the third issue, which is if you're a larger Indian Ocean country, then that has to be framed in terms of trade. But Sri Lanka, once upon a time, was the most advanced in reforms, economic openness in South Asia. Today, there's resistance to even the simplest things, that a shallow free trade agreement that you've done with Singapore is coming to political fire. With India, minimal arrangements, there's a huge number of protests. Is that internal divide over what should be the economic orientation? So we talked about identity, we talked about strategic alignment, we talk about economic alignment. Is that trapped at a time when that it can't really choose genuine free trade? I've become like Singapore, you become a connector, you become as a entrepôt for India, because your Colombo already serves that purpose. one of your Sri Lankan Airlines people once told me Sri Lankan Airlines is India's second airline because they get so much traffic out of India. So so is that orientation, I mean, you really have to open up to prosper. Is that still a fight politically has to be fought? But lastly, one other question. I mean, Sri Lanka is also a great center of Theravada Buddhism. So is that something you see? I mean, I think for connecting to Burma, to Thailand, is that something you see Sri Lanka can take advantage of in the future of a Buddhist internationalism, shall we say?
Dr. Raja, I think all three questions I have lengthily sort of given a description in my book. First one is the first three chapters are basically related about balanced foreign policy. First three chapters about balanced foreign policy, and because Sri Lanka cannot afford to look at one particular power, at this, for example, a rising power like China only, and it has to have a balanced foreign policy very clearly. So Sri Lanka, from a non-aligned nation, President Sirisena's foreign policy, as he clearly articulates in his manifesto, he says it's balanced and Asia-centric. But what I sort of discuss in the book is that Sri Lanka should balance the triple spheres of influence coming into the country. It cannot afford to take one particular side. Now, this is where the question comes in, that should India be looked at first? Now, this same discussion of the book happened a few weeks ago at Nehru Memorial, with former Ambassador Yarsinga was saying that you cannot call India a regional hegemon. I mentioned that India, we should not consult India all the time. For example, when a submarine comes, why should we tell Delhi that submarine is coming and give us permission from Delhi? It should not be looked at like that. So the same question I'm raising to him, which is raised by Yarsinga. So because we cannot look at India first policy, it's just impossible. So we have to look at a balanced policy. So with the OBO being part of the OBOR, with the US, the assistance coming in, the exports, so it has to be a balanced policy. And the two views, the nationalist view as well as the neoliberal, so the FTA is stuck there. This is where the crossroads is, because you're looking, one camp is looking at the neoliberal side, the other camp is basically on the nationalist and more populist side. So, look at the opportunity that this FTA brings to both the countries. We were 2.7 billion, that's the bilateral trade between Singapore and Sri Lanka. And there is a tariff saving of $10 million Singapore dollars. So once this is in full operation. So I think the Prime Minister is correct on bringing this FTA and working towards it. But there are certain elements in the society, nationalist elements, that are against the FTA, as you rightly pointed out. So, but again, building, preparing our institutions, like Dr. Amritdev mentioned, is important that you invest and prepare our institutions to sort of, work this out somehow. And that's something that the Sri Lankan policymakers should invest. Because even if you look at the economic point of view, which you brought, the transshipments, you rightly mentioned, Sri Lanka does not have an internal domestic market to sort of cater outside, so it is a transshipment point. So with the large scale of container traffic going, it's building up. China is the largest container ship builder right now in the world. They're the largest. But if you look at the amount of that Sri Lanka can cater, yes, we can cater. But is Hambantota a strategic port, or is it done for commercial? So I write about the 99-year lease with the Chinese. Now, this is also a question that was raised, basically to turning the debt to equity, and whether China has a complete control of the port. Now, if you look at that scenario, how it was given, I think the process was it was done in a quick way. We signed the agreements on a Sunday. We don't usually do that on a Sunday, and it happened on a Sunday in a quick ceremony, and we gave for 99 years. Then there was media releases saying we could reduce it to 70 years. And this quick the decision, rather, it was not consulted. Think tank inputs were not taken. It was not, President himself mentioned that this should go to the parliament. But it didn't go to the parliament. It was not discussed at the parliament level. So these are, I think, policymakers, limitations in the policymakers circle, and which became, a huge issue. And on the Buddhism factor, of course, there's a huge role that we could play. We could play in terms of reconciliation on the ethnic divide side, in a positive sense. This is happening, what Shulani mentioned. You could see from the communal riots which happened in the center of the country, Kandy, or the recent communal violence and all that, because it's a post-conflict nation, and these things can trigger. And if you look at the media, media was complete. We had control of the media. The government took control to sort of normalize the situation. And certain articles that was put up, that would disturb the whole social fabric. And whether we should have some strong control. And a lot of people were praising, actually, the government for controlling the media at that time to normalize the situation. Because if we didn't normalize it, just imagine, we're in a post-conflict, and you want another situation to trigger. And you can't, then it comes a question, the freedom of media, and, we have serious, issues, because we have faced as a nation, assassinations of journalists. That has happened. I've written on the book clearly on Lasantha Wickramatunge, various journalists that have been there. But, we cannot be, you have to look at these cases, investigate. There should be a closure of most of the cases. That's really important. But the society wants is also that. So while respecting the freedom of media, we should look at the other side also, basically protecting the ethnic groups and all that, especially in post-conflict.